Dr. Carolyn Everston of Vanderbilt University once said, "Supporting and developing orderly and productive classroom environments is the foundation of good classroom management." Using effective behavior management strategies is one of the key things to having a successful time within the classroom. When creating lesson plans and activities for my students, I try to think, which way can I reach them the most? How do I learn? How do they learn? And where do we differ in those areas? And it was the same instance when I was developing my interest inventory. I'm a visual learner, and I appreciate when things are eye-catching, so they do not look mass-produced. This year I discovered infographics and turned my syllabus into one, and my students loved it. Creating an interest inventory that is a complete infographic would not work for me with the information that I want for my students, but I can take away elements from it. The Jones model suggests graphics should be used for reminders, examples, or instruction. I also believe graphics are less intimidating for students. The reality therapy model believes students should only be asked to do useful work the best they can. When developing my interest inventory, I decided to use components from both models as inspiration. First, I wanted to make sure that my interest inventory looked welcoming to my students, which is why I used color. The reality therapy model believes that students should only be asked to do useful work, which is why I only included questions that I wanted to know the answers to. Nothing is worse than when you expect students to do busy work, and I wanted them to realize that this information is important for them and myself to know the answers to. In my school, I teach 8th grade English and reading are two separate classes, so we can focus on developing those individual areas separately. Anytime you ask an 8th grader what their favorite book is, more than likely they're going to say, "Oh, I don't read." But when they actually sit down and think about it, they have read a ton of books while they've been in school, and that's not even mentioning the books that some students like to read for leisure. So by asking them the question at the top of the survey, what book represents who I am today, and they need to explain that, they really have to think about the literature that they've read, and they have to make that connection to themselves and to their world surrounding them. In the yellow box, I ask what genre of literature they enjoy the most, and then what characteristics about that genre makes it the most appealing to them. And the reason I ask this is because I don't want to just pick books that I like and force them to read that. Nobody's going to enjoy that if they do not find that genre of book appealing to them. So one thing I like to do is to offer an array of books in different genres and allow them to choose which literature they want to read throughout the semester. And by gauging their interests of genres, I can go ahead and make a wise selection of books to offer throughout the class. Now on our orange thought bubble off to the right, it says, what comes first, the book or the movie? And this is kind of where you get the feeling of who are the true readers for pleasure and who are the students who just read because they're required to. And then lastly, I always like to find out what my students look for in an effective English teacher. What do they want from me? Because as an educator, if we can meet some of those expectations that the students set for us, they'll respect us more in the end. My personal behavior management style can be identified through a couple of models, but first, let's look at the love and logic model. This model believes that each student's self-concept is always a prime consideration, and students should always be left feeling they have some control. And I want my students to know that their thoughts are valuable, and their self-worth can determine how they live their own life. As far as students feeling they have some control, I couldn't agree more. My class is a very student-driven atmosphere. For instance, my first couple of years of teaching, I developed specific classroom rules that I thought were fair and reasonable, and they probably were. And my students responded fine. Sometimes there were some issues, but overall, it was adequate. Then last year, I decided to try something new. I had my students construct their own set of class rules in the first couple of days we had class. Now, I teach 4 different sections of English, so I kept wondering, how am I supposed to have them construct their own rules? Do I let each class period have different expectations? How do we set them? So what we came up with was my first class period developed a set, and then as the day progressed, they evaluated the list of rules. They added some, they took off some, and by the end of the day, we had constructed a full list of rules. The following class period, I showed them to all the classes, and they voted whether or not they wanted to start integrating them into the classroom, and they did vote. And this picture right here is the rules that they came up with. They wanted to make sure that everybody had respect, used honesty, used responsibility, showed positivity, and came to class prepared. And overall, it could just be summed up and have integrity. And what I found out were a couple of things. First off, when my students wrote their own rules, they remembered them better. I was not somebody who had to stand there and act like a drill sergeant and say, you can't do this, you can't do that. But they had it already in their heads because they wrote them themselves. Second, they held each other accountable because they constructed them themselves. If they saw somebody being disrespectful or not being truthful, they would call them out themselves. I didn't even have to. And they would recognize that there was an issue that needed to be solved based upon what they built. So when students feel that they do have some control and they do have a say in what happens in a classroom, they feel more invested and therefore their behavior is more positive in the end. These class rules lead into the next model that I identify with, the reality therapy model. Reality therapy supports self-regulation and students managing their own behavior. This model also relates to me because my central focus is on positive teacher and learner relationships, student-based inquiry, and student-driven responsibilities. Teaching 8th grade English entails a large area of content to be covered in a small amount of time, but I believe concentrating on real-world situations while the students learn the content is extremely beneficial. Like in the previous slide, you saw that my students are responsible for developing their own class rules, but they're also in charge of managing their own learning growth data with charts and graphs. And then also they define their own parameters of respect. This model requires the teacher to aid the student in their decisions, not dictate the rules and regulations, like other models, such as the assertive discipline model, which has a very black and white approach to teaching. My classroom procedures are based on love and logic, but also the logical consequences model. This model suggests students learn throughout their interaction with their environment. The first things all teachers do at the start of a class is take attendance and pass out papers, and that can waste a lot of valuable time. Plus, it also gives students a chance to allow negative behavior to occur. So there are some ways that I have found for my students who interact with their environment that cuts down on the possibility of negative behaviors. First is our attendance charts. When students walk into the classroom, they grab the magnet that is next to their name and they move it off the chart. That way, if there is a magnet left next to their name, I know that they are absent and I can quickly just walk over to the computer and enter it in. Next, instead of passing out papers and wasting time, my students know that after they take their attendance magnet off, they go over to our shelving units and they grab the blank papers that they need for class today. Also, instead of passing back graded papers and wasting time, anytime that I grade their work, I just place it in their individualized mail slots so they can grab it at the start of class as well. Students need to know what's expected of them, so it's important to have objectives on the classroom board or on the wall somewhere so they know what's going to take place in class today and what they're learning. This right here is our goal board, and students see the lessons that we learn as we go throughout each unit, our 6 traits of writing. And by the end of the year, they see how much they've accomplished, but they can also look forward and see what to expect in the future. This is an interactive bulletin board that the students use. They find it to be fun because it's Twitter related, but it's also a way for me to understand where they're at, and it's a formative assessment. Now, in my first couple of years of teaching, I heard what all teachers hear: I don't have a pencil. And when a student doesn't have a writing utensil, they think that that gives them a free pass to get out of the work, and they'll just sit there the whole time. While you're scrounging around looking for a writing utensil, asking students for it, it wastes time, and again, it presents those events that can turn out poorly for students based on their behavior. So what we have in our classroom is a tub that is just full of pencils. Anytime they need one, they can go and get it. So this places the responsibility on the student's shoulders and allows them to problem solve themselves. I am a teacher, but first and foremost, I am a Christian. And while I may not be able to pull my Bible out in the middle of class and use it to directly instruct my students, I can allow God to guide me through my instruction. 1 Kings tells of the story of a wise king, King Solomon. One day, 2 women came to him in a serious argument. They were both claiming to be a child's mother. King Solomon's answer was to cut the baby in half so they can each have a piece. Now, I believe Solomon gave this out-of-the-box response for a reason. The true mother would never want her child harmed and would speak out, and that is exactly what happened. The real mother offered her child to the other woman in hopes to save her son's life. King Solomon used unconventional techniques, but this is what made him the wisest leader in the Old Testament. I pray that God gives me the wisdom when leading my students and guides me when trying to find strategies that best suit my students. 2 Timothy 2, verses 24 through 26 state, "And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. Opponents must be gently instructed, in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of truth, and that they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will." May God continue to give me the knowledge of truth so I can lead my students to a successful future.